Hello again, dear students in Health Business Management Master's Program. We move on to discuss the data collection methods in qualitative studies, and I chose to start from designing a qualitative research question. When you start to, we'll discuss this also in the thesis seminars, but I thought that this would be a rather nice way for you to get ready for the assignment that we drafted for you again, for you to have exposure to collecting qualitative data. So we actually want you to design a small research question, and that's why I have the first two slides here. You want to state your goal by using a verb. Now that we are dealing with qualitative research, the word is usually describe, to characterize, to understand, to identify. And then once you've done that, chosen the verb, then you identify a topic of interest. What is it specifically that you intend to address? You should define the sample and the setting. So who is it that is going to be involved in your study, and the setting? What sort of setting is it? Is it a small, medium business surrounding? Is it primary care setting, specialist setting? So sample and setting needs to be expressed. And then try to be as precise as you can. And of course you want to make sure that your question is feasible. I've got a couple of examples here for you about good qualitative research questions, and you can judge for yourself whether in these examples the criteria are being met. The verb, the topic of interest, the sample, and the setting. Let's first talk about interviewing, because it's one of it may be the mostly used method of collecting data for qualitative methodologies. It can be used in quantitative studies as well, and you guys in particular might end up doing some sort of marketing surveys or which are in an interview format. They are very organized and systematic, but you might also end up using interviewing as a method of other type of data collection for your study. Here is a summary about what the forms of interview that are available. So they are either standardized or non-standardized. Standardized meaning that the questions are ready-made. They're usually very, very short, and you just sort of interview and write down what the respondent said. Non-standardized can either be conducted one-on-one, or you can have one interviewer and several interviewees, so one-to-many. One-to-many can be done in groups, or e-group interview, as e-group interviews, especially now in this era, not such a bad choice at all. Or you can do either one of them as focus groups. The focus group, we'll talk later about that. The one-on-one interviews, often in a traditional form, they take place in a face-to-face situation. Telephone interviews are an option, as are electronic interviews these days. So many different types for you to choose from. When it comes to qualitative interviewing, in addition to what we just said previously, narratives is a form of getting out of it. So narrative is a story. It is somebody's story about an event in his or her life. When you are interviewing somebody, whether it's group or individual, you need to think about language issues. You need to make sure that the language and the concepts that you're using are understandable for your participants. You need to make decisions about recording and transcribing. We'll talk briefly about that as well. And most importantly, when you are designing a research proposal, you need to draft an interview guide. Now, this is a set of questions that you will be using to collect your data, and that needs to be done, obviously, in advance. The non-standardized interviewing techniques are usually there when you want to explore something or to profoundly understand the participants' reasons for their attitudes or opinions. Typical example is that establishing a personal contact is of significance because the personal contact makes your interviewee, makes your participants more relaxed. They feel more comfortable in such a setting, rather than if you stay back and are very formal and severe. Non-standardized interviews techniques are good for if you need to collect data that involves very complex questions, or for some reason you have a need to change the order of the questions that you are using. Semi-structured interviews in turn are obviously combinations of structured and unstructured interviews. You might, if you're using this sort of technique, you might have a thematic sort of a list of questions, but the questions and their order may vary, so it doesn't exactly follow the same protocol when you move from one interview to the next one. And then what is typical for semi-structured interviews is that you're sort of trying to probe. You're trying to, when you get your answer, you try to ask further, to seek clarification, to make sure that you have understood what the participant said. Then we have another form of interviews, and that is called the in-depth interviews. Again, here's a list of some typical situations where you would prefer to make an in-depth interview rather than a semi-structured. This, compared to the previous ones, is a rather informal type of interviewing technique. There are no strict guidelines, and this allows the discussion to be open and not necessarily very concise in nature. This is the reason that an in-depth interview is a rather demanding type of an interview, and I would not recommend it for someone who does not have experience in interviewing previously. So other typical characteristics for in-depth interviews is this, that the researcher often begins with a broad question, and then it comes sort of narrows down into a certain focus. And it is pretty much not so much the interviewer, but the interviewee, the participant, who will sort of decide which way we go from here. There are certain things that need to be considered when you're conducting interviews, and some of them are listed here. It pays off to sort of prepare yourself properly, at least in the terms of use of clear language and clear concepts which are precise. So what we ought to do is we ought to avoid vague words. We also ought to avoid poor question construction. For example, you do not want to lead your interviewee in any way, and you want to avoid presuming questions, so hypothetical questions. Sensitive questions are sometimes cannot be avoided, but I would leave those towards the sort of end of the interview, when the interaction between the interviewees is already in place, so to say. You know each other. Opinion questions can also be somewhat dangerous or challenging, because in opinions feelings easily become or surface. Focus groups are the type of groups at which you want to connect. If you want to interview a group of people who have gone through the same experience, and it can be a powerful tool then, because the discussion then can become very vivid, and you will get rich data by allowing the group members to discuss. Usually 4 to 8 people, 8 interviewees, in my opinion, is already absolute maximum. You cannot control it otherwise. Your job as an interviewer is that of a moderator. So you introduce the topics and help the group to sort of participate by inviting also the quiet ones to take part in the discussion. So this is your job as an interviewer, is sort of have control over the discussion, to make sure that the respondents, the participants, are discussing whatever it is that you wanted them to discuss. So you don't want to allow any sidelines in terms of forgetting what we are there for. We listed a number of examples of when focus groups might be beneficial for business and business management research, and well, this is just a list of such things. The next slide is about the actual situation when you are in the interview and what you should be doing. Previously we already discussed about the importance of an atmosphere. So the participants need to be able to feel at ease. So you want to invest in trying to build up trust and rapport, and that is where your personality comes into a big role. And you want to explain what you are there for, so the study aim. You want to explain the confidentiality issues. They want to hear, the participants want to hear that they cannot be identified from your final data. Very important thing. And that you will not talk about the issues or the matters that are being discussed in the room with anyone else. You are the only one who knows about them. The effect of a recorder, smaller the better. I agree. This is from a textbook of qualitative research methods, and I agree. When I was collecting data for one of my studies, I first had a very old-fashioned type of tape recorder, which was quite heavy and quite big, and it caught people's attention. Then later on, I got a small digital device, and I noticed that it was much easier for the participants to forget about the recorder when it was small. So this is very true. Non-verbal behavior needs to remain in your focus as well, because sometimes we do things which make the participant feel uncomfortable. You want to do that, so it's good to be aware of this as well. A most critical skill in all interviewing is listening. Not to interrupt, not to offer advice, not to share your personal experience about something, but rather go like, that's interesting. Could you tell me more about that? After the interview, checked with audibility and completeness, the recording. It pays off to listen to it soon after you're finished with the interview, because it might be some hints for you of how to continue in the next interview. There might be some more questions that appear to be necessary, or you might notice something in your own style of interviewing that doesn't sound so good after all, so you have a chance to make changes for the next one. You need to make a decision about what to do when you're transcribing things. Now it takes about 3 hours of transcription. Transcription means that you're writing out when you hear the interviewer, writing it as text. And 3 hours per 1 hour of interviewing, and that is for somebody who's done it before. So if you're doing, this is one of the time-consuming phases of any studies which are using interviewing as a method, because you just need to be aware of it. And if it's possible to allow someone else to do it, then it might not be a bad option. There are some software which have voice recognition, so if you have access to that, it's also an option for you. Unfortunately, at Metropolia we don't have